This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on Axial Eastern beliefs. So the first thing that I want to start off with when we talk about these beliefs are some philosophical concepts. It's very important you understand these because these are what are used in understanding philosophy and why we do philosophy. The first is ontology, the nature of something. So what do I mean when I say this? When we talk about things like human nature, like who are we as human beings? Are we animals? Are we different from animals? What is it about us that makes us unique or similar? We're talking about ontology, the nature of something. The next one is epistemology. What is the method that we use to get information? Do we use a rationalist method like philosophy? Do we use a scientific method to get evidence? Do we use religious methods where we look to holy books, saints, or religious figures for authority? Third issue is teleology, the purpose of human life. Or is there even a purpose to human life? There are people today who would argue that human life really in the end has no real purpose to it. We create our own destiny. Teleology asks that question. What is the purpose of human life? And if there is a purpose, how do we try to figure out what that is? Now, your answers to these questions are going to determine a lot of what you think. I know this may sound strange and you might kind of even wonder, well, isn't this just philosophy? These kinds of things never really lead to any answer. And one of the criticisms I always hear of philosophy is that anybody can do philosophy, anybody can come up with whatever they believe. Well, that's not really true. Think about this for a moment. Let's say that you are a religious person. You believe that there is such a thing as a God. In other words, your ontology is you are a creature of God. Well, then your epistemology is going to be looking to some kind of religious authority or religious holy book. The teleology or purpose that you have then is to have a relationship with that God, which means you're probably going to believe in things like morality. You're probably going to believe that there is an overall purpose. You're probably going to believe that authority has a purpose. But let's switch that up for a minute. Let's assume that you believe that the ontology for human beings is we are just who we are. There is nothing outside of ourselves. Well, in that case, where are you going to look for your information? Well, you can't really look to religion at that point because it doesn't really have any authority. You're probably going to look to something like science because science gives us knowledge about what actually exists in a concrete way. Well, what about teleology? Well, at that point, how can you really claim that there's a purpose to human life? If all there is just what there is, then we kind of create our own purpose. So the point is when you argue something about these three concepts, they kind of lead to like steps or foundations. They will eventually determine the rest of what you believe about the world around you. So that gets into the major axial beliefs, and the sort of like grandparent of all of them, the one that begins everything, is Hinduism. Hinduism started when Aryan invaders developed the Hindu belief system within India. The idea is that there is this great impersonal force that gave us creation, and within Hinduism, this is known as the Great Om. Now, the Great Om is not like the God of monotheism. This is not a personal God. This is not a God that has any kind of individual attributes to itself, and it's not a God who thinks or creates in the sense of like a personal God like Yahweh or like Jesus or like Allah. The Om is very different. The Om is an impersonal force that came into being and created an explosion of being that has led to all of the things that we see. This means that all the universe is connected. Well, why is that important? Well, think of Hinduism and what you probably have seen in like popular videos or movies. Hindus believe in something called karma. Karma is the law of cause and effect. Now, where do we get that from? Well, it comes from this ontological statement of the Great Om. If there is a Great Om that starts everything, that means everything is connected. In other words, everything has a cause and effect. Now, you might be thinking of cause and effect in the sense of like empirical types of things, like gravity. But we're going beyond that here. This is a spiritual cause and effect. If everything is eventually connected back to this Om, that means we're connected back to the Om. And that means everything we do has a cause, it has an effect, and we are a part of that, and that is known as karma. So within Hinduism, when you do an action, it will inevitably lead to an effect, which will inevitably cause more causes and cause more effects. We are a part of that great Om. And that's why people in Hinduism believe in karma, the law of cause and effect. Now, what is our eventual goal, or teleology, according to Hinduism? Our goal is to escape the constant cycle of the Om in order to return back to what is known as Brahma, or the real essence of the Om. Brahma is the calm or peacefulness at the essence or center of the Om. We want to get out of the constant cycle of the Om and get back to that pure sense of essence. Buddhism. So Buddhism is a reform movement of Hinduism, and it was started up by a man named Siddhartha Gautama, who lived somewhere between 600 to 400 BCE. We don't know exactly when because we really don't have a written history of Buddhism. Of what we have is an oral history. Most of the life of the Buddha, or Siddhartha Gautama, is mythical, and it's taught through the eyes of his followers in Buddhist traditions. Supposedly, he grew up sheltered by his father, the king of a particular small city within India. And as he grew up, the point of his father sheltering him was to shelter him from all of the problems outside in the real world. Well, eventually, Siddhartha Gautama escaped from this small kingdom and went outside of the palace in order to see what life was like. And when he did, he discovered true suffering in life. So he escaped from the kingdom, he went out on his own, and he adopted what's called an ascetic lifestyle, in which he denied all of reality's comforts. But eventually he came to realize that this really wasn't the best way to go. In fact, he almost died when he tried this ascetic lifestyle because he wasn't eating for some period of time. So eventually he came down to the notion of a middle path. And the middle path was meant to be a way to affirm life, but at the same time not become attached to a lot of life's temptations. So here are the Buddhist teachings. Siddhartha Gautama reached enlightenment and knowledge through what are known as the Four Noble Truths: truth of suffering, truth of cause of suffering, truth of end of suffering, and truth of path to end suffering. So what does that mean? Well, truth of suffering is that suffering is our basic problem. This is what we have an issue with. And the suffering that we have is caused by ignorance. Ignorance of our situation. Well, what is the ignorance of the situation? What really is suffering? According to Siddhartha Gautama, our ignorance of the change in reality. For Siddhartha Gautama, change was a constant. Change was happening all the time within India. And whenever anybody tried to grab hold of the material reality that was there, they became ignorant of this change. And when you become ignorant of the change that's taking place and you attach yourself to the changing reality, you will inevitably suffer. So what are you trying to do then to escape from the suffering? You have to escape the changing reality. Go back to the calm essence of the Om, what he called not Brahma, but Nirvana. So how do you do this? Well, he provided an eightfold path to enlightenment, and there are a whole bunch of different things that you can do in order to get to enlightenment, but the eventual goal was this. It was to detach yourself from the constant suffering that was taking place and see yourself as a part of something much bigger. See yourself as a part of this impersonal energy force that we are all connected to and that we all want to eventually escape to. The point then that he was arguing is that life in the end is an illusion. And what we are trying to do is to detach ourselves in order to eventually come to nirvana. Mahayana and Thervada. So over time, Buddhism reformed itself. When Siddhartha Gautama died, keep in mind, Siddhartha Gautama did not see himself as a god. He saw himself as what's called a Vatsavita. A Vatsavita is an enlightened one. In fact, within the Buddhist tradition, the most enlightened Vatsavitas will eventually even detach themselves or give up nirvana in order to come back and help other people to reach nirvana. Within Buddhism, then, one of the primary values of Buddhism is compassion. So where does compassion come from within the Buddhist framework? Well, if you're supposed to detach from reality, you detach from all of your individual desires. And you want to make sure one of the biggest individual desires is self-interest. So you want to detach from that and help other people to also realize how they can detach from self-interest so that we can all reach that calm and sense of harmony. So eventually, Buddhist monks were sent out by the king Ashoka. He sent them out along the Silk Road to both China and Egypt. The problem was that these Buddhist monks were preaching about detachment to merchants. And remember, merchants are self-interested and they want to make a living. So the Silk Road eventually changed the Buddhist message. And instead, Mahayana and Thervada taught a different way in order to reach nirvana. No longer would they reach it through pure spiritual detachment, but rather they could do it by doing rituals and practices. Mahayana and Thervada changed Buddhism into emphasizing a divinity, so Buddha now becomes God. Rituals and practices are now introduced in order to help people over the long term to detach. This allows people to accommodate trade while also reaching long-term detachment. And the two main sects for this are Mahayana and Thervada. So how did they change? Thervada remained very orthodox in its authority. However, Thervada and Mahayana both accepted rituals, prayers, statues, and deities in the system. Now, if you think about it, this is very much opposed to the original Buddhist teachings. No longer do we see reality as an illusion and that we want to detach as soon as possible. but rather we can use reality for a long-term sense of detachment. Also notice that there is now an acceptance of deities in the original, which is not in the original teachings of the Buddha. And if you travel around the southeastern part of Asia today, you will oftentimes notice the Buddha being treated as a deity. That's not the original teaching, but it is allowed and accommodated as people are being brought into this new Buddhist system along the Silk Road. Chinese thought. So Chinese thought is going to rise out of a particular context, and it's the era of warring states. This came at the end of the Chu dynasty, and it developed into what are known as the 100 schools of thought. But I'm going to narrow this down to three major philosophies that you need to remember: Confucianism, Chinese legalism, and Daoism. So Confucianism. Kongzi, or Confucius, taught that society was a chain of relationships. It was a hierarchy of families and relationships of what is known as familial piety, or obligations and duties between members. So the primary values here are duties and obligations, and this is in order to create order. Kongzi was not himself an atheist, or at least we don't know, we don't think he was an atheist, but he oftentimes, when he was asked, are there gods, is there a God, he would answer, look, we can argue about this forever, but the truth is we're never going to come to an exact definition if there's a God or not. We need something in our social and political life that is practical. And so he was very suspicious of any philosophy that stressed the afterlife. Now that's going to be very important because in the long term in China, Confucianism is always going to have a battle with Buddhism. Buddhism is going to teach there is an afterlife, nirvana, that we need to detach and get to. Confucianism teaches we need to remain practical in society and we need to have practical solutions. So these two are going to have a constant battle, but they are also going to merge a lot as well within China. So here's a good graphic that demonstrates the way Confucianism looked like. The emperor was the father figure of society. Below him would be local governors. And then there was the family relationship, the father, the mother, the eldest son, the younger siblings. This was a hierarchy. It was a patriarchal hierarchy. Within this hierarchy, it was believed that the male was the best symbol of leadership. So even the eldest child in one of the lowest rungs should be preferably a son, because that will maintain the duties and obligations in a masculine symbolism. Chinese legalism. The competing philosophy with Confucianism was Chinese legalism. Under Chinese legalism, the belief was that human nature was evil and nasty. The Chinese emperor was supposed to keep people in order to create stability. So all the power was centralized into the Chinese leader's authority. Now, if you have that much centralization of authority, I can imagine, when you think of Western belief systems, that we fear too much authority is going to eventually create corruption. In fact, we have a saying for this. The more power, the more likely you're going to have a corruption of power. So in China, the way they tried to get around this was they would establish a series of advisors who would keep the emperor in check, and they would do that through moral advice. Now, what's going to be important about this, and I want you to remember this, is that Chinese legalism and Confucianism are constantly coming into conflict with each other. Chinese legalism calls for a centralization of authority for stability. Chinese Confucianism calls for authority and stability, but through a much more persuasive way of having family obligations, piety, and through using merit by people rising to the top. And then the last major philosophy of China, Daoism, which can be spelled with a T or a D. It was formed by Laozi, or Laozu, in the 3rd and 4th centuries BCE. He stressed the balance of human reason with nature. Nature here is not meant to be the biological world. Don't think of this as chemicals or elements, trees, rocks, water, or even at the most basic level, the chemicals and atoms of the material world. But rather, nature here is meant the spiritual balance of the universe. You will notice this is very similar to Hinduism. It's very similar to Buddhism. The idea here is that there is a spiritual balance to the universe that we can sense through our intuition. Now, this does not mean that rationality is unimportant. We need rationality. But rationality is finite. It cannot grow enough to really understand reality. At some point, we have to let go of our rational control and accept our intuition and realize that reality is an illusion and we can only attach into truth through our intuition. Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrianism is established within the Eastern region, or at least considered that way. It's really in Central Asia with Persia, but it's actually in many ways very similar to monotheism that we're going to see out in the western part of the world. Now, Zoroastrianism was started in Persia by a man named Zarathustra, and he merged together monotheism and pantheism. The main god within this belief system is Ahura Mazda, who is either monotheist or all of reality. So notice here the bridge that's taking place. A monotheist god to the west East, the notion of the impersonal force. There is a main evil god called Ahriman, who is the creator of chaos. And this god is constantly coming into conflict with Ahura Mazda. Individuals must do the good in order to bring about order and return the universe to stability. Now notice some very interesting things here that we see out of this. Notice the merging or the bridge between the two parts of the world. There's a good god and an evil god. Sounds like monotheism, right? God versus the devil. Yet at the same time, Ahriman is the creator of chaos. Mazda is the creator of creation. Well, that sounds a lot like Hinduism. So here we see this bridge that's taking place between both worlds, so you can see how trade is impacting the passage of ideas. So what conclusions can we bring from all this? Axial beliefs were formed in the context of diversity and trade. They happen along the Silk Road trade route in the Indian Ocean. Axial philosophies then are trying to explain the tendency towards so much change that's taken place in society. And what they come down to, what's common amongst all of them, is a justification of hierarchy, duties, and obligations. And notice that amongst most of them, the stress is upon an impersonal force that would lead people to detach from the material world, and in some cases reach nirvana. In most cases, justify our obligations and duties to one another, and most importantly, to centralized authority.